like to talk about the letter to the Hebrews, which is the middle reading. But just a thing about the gospel. Jesus gives that parable about the administration of goods and being ready. And Peter asks, is this parable for us? And then Jesus goes on to give another parable. But the lesson in the second parable is, if you're in the job of administration, then that first parable was for you. If you aren't in the job of administration, then it isn't. And that's why Jesus finishes by saying, the one who's been given much, much will be demanded from them. Because if you remember, Peter is the one who's been put in charge. So he says, if you're in charge, this parable is for you. And much will be demanded of you because of the position you have. I'd like to look at the Hebrews. The letter to the Hebrews is Paul's meditation basically on Abraham. And what he's talking about is Abraham's steadfastness with regards to the promise of God. The promise Abraham received, if you remember, is that Abraham was to be the father of many nations, that he was to lead a people who would ultimately be the most important people on the face of the earth, and that they would administer all other nations as well. And so he gets this promise from God. And having gotten this promise from God, we watch him become more and more elderly, passing the time when either he or his wife would have a child and having no child at all. And he still holds to the promise. The next thing is he needs to leave the land where he is living and go out in another land where he has no protection or anything. And so he holds to God's promise and goes on. The next thing that happens is they do have a son born, and then God asks him to sacrifice the son. So he holds to the promise and takes the son up the mountain to be sacrificed. You remember the story where the angel intervened. He brought his son down and all this. And what the scriptures are basically telling us is that Abraham held the promise of God in his hand. And holding that promise, though there was no reason to actually believe it, no reason to believe it would ever happen, he held the promise, and in effect, he made it happen. Because he went about it systematically as though this will be. And he never allowed anything to dissuade him or put him aside. And he ultimately found it. When I read a story like that, I'm reminded that, that's the basic thing that takes place in people's lives naturally as well as spiritually. That people achieve goals because they lock on to some goal, and as the time goes on, they stick to the goal, even though they feel distractions or it doesn't look as though it's successful. They stick to the goal, and they ultimately arrive. And that's one of the great lessons of human life, is the idea of attaching yourself to it. The symbol in the scriptures use of that is a grappling hook. And a grappling hook was a very large hook and had 3 like fish hooks on it. And you would throw it over a wall and actually hope it hooked onto something heavier than you. And then you would use the rope to go over the wall. And that's really the symbol of what it is in human life, that you sort of lock onto something. You can't really see it, but it's what you dream or what you hope. And don't give up. You actually hold on to it and, in effect, actually make it happen. And so the scripture reminds us that's true in the religious life as well, that the goal that God has put before all of us is a certain level of holiness, a certain level of goodness, a certain level of rectitude in our lives, a level of rectitude, holiness, and everything that doesn't exist in any of our lives right now. And God asks us to hold to that as a promise and work towards it. And ultimately, he will see it happen.